What is the root cause of the Afghanistan debacle? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show, as y'all know, that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy in the context of the burning issues of the day. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back to the Libertarian Angle.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, you started a new school year, huh? You back at it already?
Started last week.
Yeah, how are things going?
It's a great group of students. It's nice to be back in the classroom because I spent the last year and a half Zooming my classes.
And, so you're back in person in the class?
Yes, I'm actually in my office at the Citadel. We have a new building. Spanking new building. It's very, very high tech, very nice.
All right, well, Richard, as you know, the burning issue of the day is the Afghanistan debacle. After 20 years, the Taliban is back in power. The U.S. military has been defeated. Still, death and destruction all the way up to the very end. And of course, everybody is jumping on the bandwagon to criticize Biden for what he did and how he handled this thing. And of course, there's all variations as to what the criticism is, how it's manifesting, that he handled the evacuation wrong, that he shouldn't have gotten out, that he should have kept troops there. The criticisms just go on. And some of them even go back to Obama, that Obama should have kept the surge of U.S. troops there, and that would have won the war. Some of them go back even further than that. Well, they go back to Trump, of course, and they criticize Trump for cutting the deal with the Taliban that was going to end U.S. involvement in the war. But very few of them are going back to what I consider really is the root problem. And it was a problem that Americans were not ready to debate and discuss back in the post 9/11 era, where we were raising this notion that the invasion of Afghanistan was going to be a disaster. I mean, as you'll recall, we were opposing that invasion, and those were difficult times for FFF, as you'll recall. I'd say that was the most difficult period in the 31-year history of this foundation. The predominant environment at that time, especially for those of you that weren't around at that time, that were born afterward or were real little at that time, it's virtually impossible to explain how things were. I mean, the predominant sentiment was, anger and fear and thirst for vengeance. And so when George W. Bush proposed or said that he was going to invade Afghanistan, I mean, everybody was on board with this thing, or most everybody, including a lot of libertarians. I mean, the predominant sentiment of the libertarian movement was, this is an act of war. We have to go into Afghanistan. And even to this day, there are libertarians that say that was the right thing to do, but that they're upset because their plan would have succeeded in accomplishing whatever they say they want to accomplish with their plan. But we were getting donation cancellations. We were getting cancellations of support. As you'll recall, when we started talking about, what motivated the attackers here, because that's the critical question here, is what motivated these attackers? Man, we got, you're trying to justify what they did. You're defending them. You love the terrorists. I mean, rational thinking was in very short supply. And we had to cut expenses. We had to cut payroll, salaries, author fees, everything, because our income had plummeted. But we never wavered. We never wavered. We continued for 20 years saying this was the wrong thing to do. And I think it's important that we keep focusing on that, not to sit here and say, we were right, but because it is so critical to the future direction of this country that we still analyze why it was wrong to invade Afghanistan. I mean, if you look at those 9/11 attacks, U.S. officials said, this is the hatred for America's freedom and values. That's why they hate us. And they compared the terrorist attacks to sort of like the COVID pandemic. They said, oh, terrorism has hit other parts of the world and it's finally arrived in America. Oh, we have no choice but now to invade Afghanistan and kill them before they come and kill us here. Well, right after the 9/11 attacks, we were saying, no, we've got to analyze what motivated them. And what was it that motivated them? It was U.S. interventionism. That after the U.S. government, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA lost their official enemy in 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they needed new official enemies, bad, to justify their existence and their ever-increasing power, influence, budgets. So they went into the Middle East and they began killing people. And you've got the Persian Gulf intervention where they killed thousands of Iraqi troops. Then you've got the sanctions that contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. You had the stationing of troops in Islamic Holy Lands. You've got the no-fly zones over Iraq. I mean, all of these were killing people, not to mention the unconditional support for Israeli government that was stirring up a lot of anger. And so you had the attack on the World Trade Center in '93, which was no different principle from what happened several years later on 9/11. The attack on the USS Cole, the attacks on the embassies in East Africa, and then the 9/11 attacks. It was just a continuum, and they were all driven by this anger and rage over U.S. interventionism in the Middle East. And so what we were saying is that the worst thing that you can do now is invade Afghanistan and, of course, then later Iraq, because all you're doing is feeding into this. You're killing more people. You're generating an endless supply of terrorism. And so that's why the war on terrorism became endless. I mean, U.S. officials were saying that this is going to go on forever. It was a better racket than even the Cold War racket on the anti-communist crusade. And because it was going to guarantee these ever-increasing budgets for the national security establishment. And I remember you and I talking at the time about, let's put a bounty out for bin Laden. That's who they suspected of orchestrating this thing, and wait him out, just like they waited out Ramzi Youssef, who is one of the guys that did the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. They finally found him in Pakistan. They go in there, they capture him, they bring him back to the U.S., they indict him in federal district court. He's now serving a life sentence. But if you invade, you're going to kill countless people that had nothing to do with 9/11, and that's what happened. I mean, most of the, I don't know, was it a couple 100,000 people that were killed in Afghanistan, not to mention the ones that are maimed and injured and had their homes destroyed, had nothing to do with 9/11. I mean, it was just an absolute disaster. And then, of course, the U.S. troops who end up dying for nothing. The whole thing's a fiasco. But we have to keep in mind, Richard, that it is all centered around U.S. interventionism. If we don't get that lesson, then all we get from this is, oh, well, these presidents didn't follow the right plan for the invasion and occupation and regime change of this government. And then if that's the lesson that's learned from this, all we do is just engage in new interventions in the future. And one of the most amusing tests I've heard is where they say, well, we need to intervene, but only when it's in our interest, that Afghanistan was not in our interest or Iraq wasn't in our interest. Well, that's ridiculous. That's no limitation. I mean, the presidents who do the invading and the Pentagon and the CIA, I guarantee you, will always believe it's in our national interest. And they're the ones deciding what's in our national interest. So what we really need to do is challenge this entire concept of interventionism itself. What do you think, Richard?
Well, you've said it all. I guess our time is up now. We were already criticizing these forms of foreign interventionism long before 9/11. FFF was founded in 1990, and shortly after that, you and I and other writers for the foundation were challenging the history of American foreign interventionism, especially in the 20th century, beginning with the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War policies. And we were warning in our essays and in several of the collections we put together as books, that this was all going to be setting the ground for more conflicts, more antagonism of the others who will come and view us as their enemies, and to whom they will respond. Right after the 9/11 attack, but before our invasion of Afghanistan, I had been asked by the Christian Science Monitor for their online edition at that time to participate in a symposium on, well, what to do. And with all of this hoopla that was going on by both, as we put it, the left and the right, even libertarians in some cases, that was saying, well, we have to go in militarily, we have to insert ourselves. I argued in that symposium that had a wide readership that the origin of this came not from the attack, but from our prior interventionism. That whenever we invade a country or participate in the political affairs of another country with our military, our diplomatic, and our financial aid, we invariably pick a side. And the side that we don't pick in these foreign domestic disputes and disagreements will end up viewing us as the supporters of their opponents. And as the phrase goes, the friend of my enemy is my enemy. Well, if we go and support the Saudi government and we station troops there, we give them military aid, and there are those in Saudi Arabia who are often religious fanatics, unfortunately, who view this as the presence of the crusader, the infidel, in the holy sites and the holy country of their faith. Don't be surprised if, again, following their interpretation of that faith, they will feel called upon by their scripture, as again they're interpreting it, to take actions to expel us, to fight the power that is desecrating the holiest of the holy. That if you read all of Osama bin Laden's public statements, the vast number of them where he talks about why is he so opposed to the United States, almost always, I didn't read every one, so I can't say everyone, but the ones that I read, and I think I read a good number at the time, he was basically saying that it was America's presence in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East in general, stationing of American troops in the country that is meant to be the guardian of Mecca and Medina, the spreading of cultural undermining of the Muslim faith due to America's military and diplomatic presence in that country. And he viewed himself as defending his faith and his country by responding to what he considered America's illegitimate and harmful intervention in the part of the world in which he lived and viewed as sacred. Now, I also pointed out that Bush clearly was laying the groundwork for an invasion of Afghanistan. Everyone was talking about that, the military buildup. They weren't going to say where or when, but it was clear that this was coming because the Taliban refused to give in to American demands. Among them was turning over Osama bin Laden and others viewed as perpetrators in this attack to the U.S. government. And when they refused to do that, well, then that was an insult to injury, and therefore we have to invade the country. I said no. I said, listen to George W. Bush's own address to the joint session of Congress, which he gave shortly after 9/11. He said this was not going to be an easy task, that there are guilty parties, suspected perpetrators, and that they need to be brought to justice. He even drew attention to the Old West bounty hunters. And I said, rather than invade a country with all of this American military personnel, the vast financial cost, the cost that it invariably will be to the Afghani people in life and property and the social cohesion of their own society, the U.S. should do what Bush said. Don't send one American soldier there. Put a huge bounty, $500 million, $500 million, tax-free in any currency, for Osama bin Laden, brought in as the lead suspect to stand trial, and for the suspected lead associates, $250,000 tax-free in any currency, and set loose retired special forces, Green Berets, French foreign legionnaires, any adventurer of fortune, mercenaries who wanted themselves as private individuals to go in, cross their border at their own personal risk to Afghanistan and track these people back and bring them back, dead or alive, I guess, but preferably alive, to stand trial. And that would avoid this, because once we invaded, we were going to be involving a huge cataclysm, both for the people and for of Afghanistan and for the United States. And then I also pointed out, and you were too at the time, you recall, is that what was Bush's domestic response to the 9/11 attack? Not just to amass the American military forces for an invasion of another country, but the Department of Homeland Security, a new cabinet-level department that would have the duty, responsibility, and an increasing intrusive power to hunt out, search for, interdict, stop any suspected terrorist attack coming on to the shores of the United States. Never again will there be a 9/11. What did that involve, Jacob? Now you're giving a free hand to a federal agency to surveillance, to inform, to interdict, to look through your mail, to follow the keystrokes on your computer board, and read every email, every text message, because you never know who might be planning somehow, somewhere, something that would be harmful to the United States. This came into effect, and I pointed out, and I know you would too, that once you have this Department of Homeland Security meant to fight the enemies in this war of terrorism, there's no end to it. There's no end to it. You now have a dynamic of a government agency that has the self-interest to never bring an end to this war. Because what happens if at budget time, the head of the Department of Homeland Security is asked by a congressman or a senator at some of those congressional budget committees to say, well, what's the status? And he said, well, Mr. Senator, Mr. Congressman, since the funding bills begin in the House, Mr. Congressman, guess what? Mission accomplished. There's no more terrorist threat. Well done. Well done. By golly, it makes you proud to be an American. And so Mr. Congressman, we can be wound down. We don't want to rush into anything, but you never know. But let's plan to cut our budget by 1/4. And by the end of the next 4 years, just abolish the department. It's gone, Mr. Senator. See, end of story. No, that's never in their interest. They lose their rice bowl. They want bigger budgets with more authority to justify power and promotions and perks and the senses of a rush of being the lead player. This is how people in these bureaucracies think. It's, you want to say, but aren't they good people and they're just trying to do the right thing? But particularly at the top. But once you're in the bureaucratic establishment, is it not in your own interest to try to get a promotion? You're not getting promotion unless the budgets are increased and the staffing hasn't been enlarged. So once that institution has been put in place, there will never be a rationale or an excuse or a justification to abolish the Department of Homeland Security. They will be there forever until, of course, there's a radical change in the thinking on the part of the American people about the duty, responsibility, and powers of a government vis-a-vis the liberty and privacy of the citizenry. Until that change comes, that is a shift towards the classical liberal, libertarian, limited government view that the purpose of political authority is to protect our life, liberty, and honestly acquired property, and virtually nothing else. We will see a continuation and perpetuation of this and the dangers and the threats of new foreign adventures.
Yeah, well, you make a lot of excellent points. Let me address a few of them. On your point about Osama bin Laden and what was motivating him to do this, is you're absolutely right on that. And let me add to that what I previously mentioned about Ramzi Youssef. Now, Youssef was one of the guys that did the '93 attack on the World Trade Center. And when they captured him in Pakistan, of course, there was no invasion of Pakistan. There was no, send in the troops and kill hundreds of thousands of people, or even tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands. Presumably, they were working with the Pakistani authorities. They raided his home or wherever he was, and they captured him. They brought him back. And none of this, act of terrorism is a act of war. Everybody understood at that point that terrorism is a criminal offense in the U.S. Code. That's all it is, just a criminal offense. That's why he was indicted in federal district court. That's why he was tried there and convicted. But when he appeared before the federal judge for sentencing, if you read the transcript of that, you can sense the deep rage in this guy. And what he told the judge is that he says, you call us terrorists. But he says, the fact is that you all are the real butchers because of all the people that you're killing over here, including all these children with the sanctions against Iraq. And of course, on top of the sanctions was Madeleine Albright, the U.S. spokesman for the United States. She was the ambassador to the United Nations at the time. 60 Minutes asked her, hey, it's been reported that 500,000 Iraqi children have been killed because of these sanctions. How do you feel about that? And she says, well, it's a difficult issue, but yeah, those deaths are worth it. I mean, if that's not enough to throw people in the Middle East into a rage, I don't know what is. And that rage was being manifested through the statements that Youssef was making to the federal judge, which is usually not a good idea to say to a judge when you're being sentenced. And of course, he ended up getting the life sentence. And then you've got all the things that the U.S., of course, was doing before 9/11. And as you pointed out, we were writing about this. Before 9/11, we were saying, if you keep this up, you're going to see a major terrorist attack on American soil. We were publishing articles saying that. And of course, it didn't take a rocket scientist to say that, because we saw the terrorist attacks in '93 on the World Trade Center, on the USS Cole, on the embassies in East Africa. So it was just a progression. It was just a matter of time before they came to the United States. And one of my favorite authors on foreign policy is Chalmers Johnson, whose books I highly recommend. If you read Chalmers Johnson's 3 books on the terrorism and empire and foreign policy, it's a trilogy of books. You will know more foreign policy than most people in the United States. But one of his books was before the 9/11 attacks, and it was called Blowback: The Costs and Consequences of American Empire, where he specifically said, if you keep this up, this interventionism in the Middle East, the likes of which you were talking about earlier, putting troops near Islamic holy lands and so forth, the sanctions, the invasion with respect to the Persian Gulf War, killing all these people, you're going to end up with terrorist attacks on American soil, major terrorist attacks. And yet the Pentagon, the CIA, the presidents, they just ignored that. It was like conscious indifference. We don't care. And so, of course, we weren't surprised about the 9/11 attacks. And you bring up an excellent point about one of the costs of these wars, and that is the loss of our own liberties. I mean, you remember, Richard, before 9/11, going to the airport was a rather humdrum affair. I mean, you just go in there like a regular human being. It was the 9/11 attacks that gave us the pat downs at the airport, all the security there. It was a dysfunctional way of life that was a direct result of foreign interventionism. You get Homeland Security, you get the Patriot Act, you get the secret surveillance, the telecom scandals with the NSA, you get the destruction of American liberty and privacy, all because we need to defend this foreign interventionism. And then when they invade Afghanistan, it gets worse. Remember the color codes? That, we're a yellow now for a terrorist attack. Oh, wait, no, it's red now. Oh, can we go back to green? I mean, it was just absolutely ludicrous. But it brings to mind what James Madison said, that of all the enemies to liberty, war is the worst, because it encompasses all of them. And this is what the defenders of this Afghanistan invasion, including those in the libertarian movement, just ignore. That when you defend this kind of interventionist invasion, you're also defending implicitly the destruction of your own liberty and your own privacy.
Yeah, unfortunately, this attitude was to be found in some of the greatest of the existing free market writers. I won't mention his name, but he's an elder statesman still living in the free market movement, an outstanding scholar. But he came out and supporting both the invasion of Afghanistan and the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. And I sent him an email, since I've met this gentleman once or twice over the years, when he wrote this in a syndicated column. And I said, but Professor, shouldn't we be putting on our economist thinking cap? And particularly the public choice theory that people like James Buchanan and others have taught us, that once you set up a government agency, it has a life of its own, and it will be rationalizing and justifying larger budgets, more authority, greater power of intrusiveness over our lives, and that this is going to be an albatross over the necks of America, around the necks of Americans for a very indefinite future. And to show you the irrationality, he replied to my email and he said, "We are at war. Unless you understand that, you understand nothing." It's that closed-mindedness of not being able to understand, even by this outstanding thinker who I greatly admire and I've learned from. I cannot tell you how many insightful things over the decades, that this mindset of not realizing that the links of the authority, the links of causality, that however tragic 9/11 was, and how, in fact, people did perform this act, and as individuals, they should be held accountable for their crimes, as any other murderer or arsonist, for example. But that has nothing to do and separate from. In other words, how do you bring justice to those accused of this crime as individuals? Because they're not a state. They weren't a state. That was lost in this idea of this vision that it's them versus us, and they hate America because of what America stands for. And in fact, in many ways, they do. They view a Western culture as decadent and secular, and a threat to their way of life. Women can run around not wearing, coverings all over their bodies and stuff. But as to whether that would be enough to provoke them to such violent terrorist attacks, if America politically and militarily did not seem to be entering their countries and imposing its values directly and indirectly on them, it is very unlikely that we would be experiencing and have been experiencing these waves of terrorist attacks, both in the United States and in Europe, because our European allies followed us into Afghanistan and became targets for that reason as well. Spain and France, we've seen in England, we've seen these attacks, and so on and so forth. So even the most, I would say, greatest of among our elder free market statesmen in the movement today, because he's a very elderly gentleman, but still is very active, bought into this and dog is agreeing with me. It's agreeing with me. So that this path that, in the name of defending America and its freedom, you institute a course of action and a change of events that brings about the loss of the very freedom that you want to preserve.
Yeah, sorry about the background noise here. Cassie, come here. Come here. Come here. Sorry. No, you're absolutely right. Right after the 9/11 attacks, I attended a conference, or was a dinner, that was predominantly composed of conservatives and conservative-oriented libertarians. Now, there were some libertarians there, but the predominant audience was conservative-oriented libertarians and conservatives. And as we're outside after the dinner, I knew we were holding lonely ground at this point. And you recall those days, Richard, where the overwhelming sentiment was, we got to get back at them. And I was waiting for my car to be brought by the people that parked the cars, and I was standing next to a friend of ours who was working at the Heritage Foundation, which is, of course, the premier conservative think tank. And I said, "Hey, so what do you think of all this?" He didn't skip a beat. He says, "Oh, we've jumped on this immediately. We're doing position papers on favoring the war on terrorism, what we need to do, and Afghanistan, and on and on, and until our cars arrived. He never once asked me, what's your take on it? Because he knew us well enough that we would be opposed, but that was the predominant sentiment. And I remember a few weeks later, I was giving a talk to a libertarian group that had a lot of conservative-oriented libertarians in it. And when I pointed out that it is foreign interventionism that we've got to stop. Now you can do like you suggested, Richard. You can put this bounty out. You can put the Interpol alert out. You can do everything you can to capture the malefactors and bring them to justice, like we did with Youssef. But that doesn't mean that you just ignore what motivated them, the interventionism. You've got to keep focusing, because if you want to get back to a normal life where airport security doesn't exist anymore, where you don't have to worry about all this stuff, you've got to get rid of the root cause of the problem, and that's the foreign interventionism. And I gave this talk at this group, and man, the conservative-oriented libertarians just went after me big time. Oh, you're blaming America and all that nonsense that we heard. So I think what we've got to keep in mind is, what do we want in our society at this point? This is some good time for some soul searching here. The war is over. There's not all this big, massive sentiment for another invasion, and people are kind of exhausted. Now's the time for some good soul searching, when people are rational, they can think. And what do we want out of life? And I say that most people want a peaceful, prosperous, free, harmonious society. And so the next question is, how do we achieve that? And that's why we need to keep focusing on what was the root cause of this problem here with respect to the Afghanistan invasion. We've got to focus, I say, on foreign interventionism to restore our original founding policy of the United States, which was non-interventionism, as well as, and this gets to another level, a limited government republic. We've got to challenge this notion of a national security state form of governmental system that came into existence with the Cold War, and talk about restoring a limited government republic to our land.
Yeah, we have to keep in mind the person interested in these freedom ideas, who follows the press and reads various foreign policy-related magazines and so on, should keep in mind when they read this, is that all of the criticism that I have seen, either read thoroughly or skimming through so far since this was revealed from Kabul, is concerned, what has it done to America's prestige in the world? Can people trust America's word to be a reliable ally, implying that America's purpose is to be an active interventionist around the world, and that based upon this implied premise that America must be the policeman of the world, and that we have our allies, our deputies in policing the world. That for them, all their issue is, does this strengthen, weaken, or leave neutral America's reliability and stature in the global policing community? That is the wrong starting point and premise. The question is, should we even be a global policeman? Why have we become a global policeman? Is it even possible to be a global policeman? And if you take on this role, what blowback will you get from those who resent our policing of them? And how does it affect the freedoms at home? That's the context in which these things have to be thought about and discussed.
On that excellent, insightful note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at FFF.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which is free, our monthly journal. If you like our work, please support us with tax-deductible donations. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. We've got our great conference that's coming into existence on civil liberties, the critical importance of civil liberties, the restoration of civil liberties. That starts in mid-September. You can find the details on our website at fff.org. You can register for free admission. It's going to be an online series of conference talks starting on September 14th, Tuesday evening. Richard's going to be one of our speakers in the course of the series, and we got an all-star lineup. So I think you're going to really enjoy that conference. So Richard, thanks so much. I enjoyed the visit, and I'll talk to you next week.
Until next week.